New York Times opinion columnist David Brooks seems to be having a meta moment. In his latest piece, he asks if we're the problem here. The proverbial we seems to be the elite journalism class.
Brooks writes, quote, "Over the last decades, we've taken over whole professions and locked everybody else out. When I began my journalism career in Chicago in the 1980s, there were still some old, crusty, working-class guys around the newsroom. Now, we're not only a college-dominated profession, we're an elite college-dominated profession. Only 0.8% of all college students graduate from the super elite 12 schools, the Ivy League colleges plus Stanford, MIT, Duke, and the University of Chicago. But a 2018 study found that more than 50% of the staff writers at the beloved New York Times and the Wall Street Journal attended one of the 29 most elite universities in the nation."
Writer Caitlin Johnstone writes, "Mainstream journalists are cloistered Ivy League educated trust fund kids." Iraq war cheerleader David Brooks has an article in the New York Times titled, "What if we're the bad guys here?" Another one of those tired old think pieces we've been seeing for the last 8 years that asks, golly gosh, could we coastal elites have played some role in the rise of Trumpism? Like it's the first time anyone has ever considered that obvious point. Journalist Glenn Greenwald highlighted this clip where Batya Ungar-Sargon, former co-host of our show, visited with Bill Maher. Let's watch.
Journalism used to be a working class trade. It was a very low status job. Journalists lived in working class neighborhoods. They lived next door to factory workers and linemen.
Jimmy Breslin.
Exactly. Maybe a little bit more money than them. They saw themselves as outside of power, demanding justice on behalf of the little guy. Throughout the course of the 20th century, there was a status revolution among journalists to where journalism became basically an elite caste. It is now the provenance of basically people who are very, very, very highly educated, who come from rich parents, who come from money. Journalists, of course, there are exceptions, but by and large, the pathway to becoming a journalist now is through the elites, through elite universities. And that has, as journalists ascended to the ranks of the elites, they abandoned the working class that they used to belong to. And I argue that today they're using a moral panic about race to distract from the ways in which they have benefited from income inequality in America.
So Batya obviously wrote a book about this subject. She's talked a lot about it on our program. So David Brooks is basically wrote a column observing some of those same things. Some people are dunking on him for belatedly saying this when lots of people, Batya, lots of other people have been pointing this out for a while. But I don't think that it was a decent column. You can complain that it's coming too late.
So there's two camps. First of all, I would say that, to be clear, this column was not exclusively about media. That's the part that everyone's talking about, because that's the part that everyone can kind of agree on. Mm-hmm. There does seem to be consensus on the left and the right that journalism is an elite, that there's barriers to access journalism because it's low paying, especially early jobs. You have to be able to basically work for free. And also because to get entry at these institutions, they care a lot about these kind of academic credentials that they didn't used to care about. Everyone agrees about that. That's what was kind of trending yesterday. But the people on the left, like Batya and Caitlin Johnstone, are dunking on this because we've been saying this forever. It's been a concern. We've had this debate on the show about the problem with the way that news has been corporatized and centralized, and local newsrooms have gone the way of the dinosaur. People's obvious interests are when what's happening in their own communities. When they don't get any news about their own communities anymore, national news outlets have to figure out a way to get them to care about other sorts of things, and we get increasingly incendiary, polarizing news to keep people sucked in. Why should they care about something happening in Washington instead of in their small town? Well, if it's about someone coming for your kids or the woke squad or terrorism at the border, those are things that get people locked in. And is that actually good for journalism broadly? But the rest of the article got a lot of pushback from liberals because he was asking the question, are we, kind of liberal elites, the problem? We've been talking about Trumpism and blaming Trumpism and being confused about why so many people are interested in Trump after all of these years. But it's part of the problem that we're unwilling to look ourselves liberal, ourselves, we being liberal elites, and see how our policies and the way that we've been running the country when we're in charge is to the detriment of working class whites, largely, but working class people.
Right. It's something, as you've pointed out, lots of commentary reflecting on this, and David Brooks discussing a phenomenon that has been well documented, but is certainly animating a lot of the anger and vitriol to both major parties. Frankly, sentiments that Donald Trump tried to capture, sentiments that very much inflame right-wing voters right now. The feeling of out-of-touch elites. Supporting bad policies, trying to harm you, bossing you around, ordering you around, and also not having the same interests as you.
It was the whole Bernie movement. I'm sorry, what's so frustrating about it as a leftist is that this was the whole case of the Bernie movement. At the time, people like David Brooks wrote it off as some white guy fringe issue and didn't look at the fact that the same people who were interested in Donald Trump in 2016 were interested in Bernie because he was talking about these exact same problems. These problems with trade, these problems with elite access being what advances people economically, when that elite access is in fact elite because it restricts the overwhelming majority of people from getting there. And if we're going to talk about this problem in newsrooms, something that people like, I think Batia's exactly right about the diagnosis of the problem, but she also was an opponent to student debt cancellation and some of these policy solutions that are intended to bring down the barriers to accessing education. Bernie Sanders said, let's have free public colleges and universities so that we're no longer wrapped up into this hierarchical system where people feel like their lives are going to be over if they don't get into Harvard. People feel that way because in some ways it is. To truly reach it to the top, you kind of do have to go to Harvard, and that's malarkey. So why don't we try to make a more equal education system where everybody can get access, even if your parents can't afford to drive you to violin lessons 3 times a week.
I support going back to policies by which college was not free, but affordable for the people actually for the people enrolling in colleges. Subsidizing it has not helped. Obviously, right now we have the worst of both worlds because it's subsidized on the front end. People are encouraged to spend, to take out money to have. They feel like they have to. Then they have to pay it back later. It distorts the price. It allows colleges to charge whatever they want with no consideration of what is actually in the economic best interest of the people moving through the college. So I don't agree, obviously, on forgiving student loans, but we do have a very broken system.
People can't afford. The reason I took so long to leave the law and become a journalist is because of healthcare. Am I going to be able to, as I'm freelancing, afford to pay my own healthcare costs so that if I get sick, I don't end up dying in a hospital like so many Americans, are going bankrupt like so many Americans because they simply happen to contract an illness or fall ill in a way that they could not predict or safeguard against. If you really want to have more access to jobs, professional jobs like journalism, you have to think about things like Medicare for All, which is the biggest boon for anybody in any entrepreneurial capacity. If you want to start a business, the biggest cost for you is paying for healthcare for yourself and for your employees. So we have to be having a broader conversation. I think David Brooks is right to be starting this, but it does feel like a little late. And it's deeply frustrating as a leftist that there's only this interest in populist policies when we're talking about them on the right and not the left, especially because these candidates on the right sometimes say the right thing. I will completely concede that Donald Trump had a good pitch in 2016 with respect to some of these populist issues. But at the same time, he, just like Joe Biden, just like Barack Obama, all take money hand over fist from the pharmaceutical industry, and when they get in office, they don't change a thing because they're allowed to win on the condition that they maintain the status quo. And Bernie Sanders, by contrast, was someone who shirked that money and was able to have a whole career, 40 years in Congress, consistently fighting, like he's doing right now, for lowering prescription drug prices, as we talked about in another segment, because he doesn't actually take the money, and those interest groups matter. That money talks. So, this is a good start. This is a good start. Just for context, this is what is angering the liberals about this article. There's this paragraph in the beginning that says, he describes the polarization of the right. He says, this story begins in the 1960s when high school grads had to go off to fight in Vietnam, but the children of the educated class got college deferments. It continues in the 1970s when the authorities imposed busing on working class areas in Boston, but not on the upscale communities like Wellesley where they themselves live. They sit around saying other people are racist for not wanting this, but they also exclude themselves from the bargain. The ideal that we're all in this together was replaced by the reality that educated class lives in a world up here and everyone else is forced into a world down there. Members of our class are always publicly speaking out for the marginalized, but somehow we always end up building systems that serve ourselves. The critique from the left is somehow we always end up building systems that serve ourselves. No, there is an analysis of why it is that well-meaning liberal elites always are self-serving, and it's because money talks ultimately, and people preserve systems that enrich themselves. And until you actually make both journalism and government accessible to ordinary people so that you don't have to be a multimillionaire like Vivek Ramaswamy to self-fund your own campaign, or Michael Bloomberg or any of these other people who are running because they're rich and not because the people have thrown dollars behind them in support of their campaigns, then you're going to keep having not just a gerontocracy, but a class hierarchy where only millionaires are in our journalism institutions and only millionaires are in Congress, and our policies are designed by the people who write them and cover them.
I mean, that's true at the national level, but Congress is not, being in government isn't, for elected people at the state level, isn't particularly lucrative, nor is it, it's something, you don't have to be a millionaire or gazillionaire to run at the state level. Money
helps a lot. Everyone knows that the biggest task as someone running for office is fundraising. And that's because even if it's a smaller scale, a smaller race, and obviously not a congressional standard, the person who is able to self-fund their campaign, self-fund paying $10 for every lawn sign that you're going to distribute around your neighborhood, those are costs that ordinary people can't keep up with. I remember one of the first campaigns I covered, this was a congressional race, but the first campaigns I covered when I joined The Intercept back in 2018 was between Carper in Delaware and this woman who was running against him who had a hyphenated name that I'm missing right now. But what was so interesting about her is that she was genuinely working class. She was a single mother with a young kid, and she talked on the campaign trail about how the donations also enabled her to afford diapers for her child, which otherwise she struggled to get at some times. And it was incredibly compelling, but ultimately she didn't stand a chance against an established incumbent candidate from a state that is known for its close relationship with the banking industry, the state that Joe Biden is from. He's a senator from MBNA. And I remember attending one of her rallies that was in the shadow of the Bank of America building in the main downtown area in the city. And it was both thrilling and compelling, and she did better than a lot of people expected. But there's just no chance for a candidate like that to ever make it when you're up against a moneyed machine, the likes of which exist in both corporate parties in America. So these columns are great. They're a good start. But unless you start talking about the systemic barriers in both education and politics to working people actually having a shot, it's all lip service.
I mean, if the system needs to be rigged in their favor and that's the only way your candidates can win, isn't that a fundamental problem?
The system is rigged in their favor because instead of having campaign finance laws,
everyone is hypnotized by the efficacy. Look, you only get one vote. Everyone gets one vote.
Oh,
and
Robby.
This idea the left has that we're defeated every time. We can't win. Our ideas are so popular. We can't win because we're being outspent. I mean, that sounds like excuse making eventually.
So if you voters with the ephemeral democracy that we have, because again, we don't, there was that 2014 Princeton study that showed that there is zero relationship between the will of the voting public and what Congress prioritizes because of the interest of lobbying dollars. But if you think on a local level or in these kind of elections where you really do have the choice to vote for someone other than Joe Biden or Donald Trump in a primary, and you really do have the choice to vote for a third-party candidate in a general election, use those votes to try to support people who actually do get grassroots donations and are willing to disavow donations from the kinds of interest groups that have made your life a living hell, then that's the only path forward. And to really talk to your representatives about how much you value campaign finance reform, which used to be a bipartisan priority because the overwhelming majority of Americans understand that it's not one person, one vote. If millionaires and billionaires can buy their way into elections, get on ballots more easily than regular people, and then write the laws in their favor. That's the only way out of this.
Okay, more Rising after this.